Hi everyone. So this video will discuss trigonometric identities. Now, first of all, here, let me write that. Identities. An identity is just a statement that is true for all values of the unknown. Okay, so it's different from an equation because usually in an equation there is just 0, 1, or 2 solutions. But an identity, any possible value is acceptable for the unknown. And actually, I called them ratios earlier, but these here are trigonometric identities. Okay, so no, that's not what I wanted to say. I'm sorry. The trigonometric identity I wanted was the inverses. So, for example, secant is always the inverse of cosine. This is an identity. Cosecant, the cosecant of an angle is always the inverse of the sine. The cotan is always the inverse of the tan. And actually, what I meant to write here earlier was the tan. That was the tan is always sine over cosine. So these are identities because no matter what the angle is, pi over 2, pi, well, this one has some restrictions, but yeah, if you can find, if tan exists, then it's always sine over cosine. Okay, so secant, no matter what the value of the angle is, this is always the relationship. So that's an identity. The most important identity is the Pythagorean identity. Okay, and before I continue, the only reason you'll use identities is to simplify expressions. Okay, so I want you to think, just like you learned algebra, and maybe when you learned algebra, you might have been thinking, what's the point of this, right, in secondary 2 or secondary 3? But then as you furthered your studies in math, we constantly use algebra to simplify, to solve, etc. It's the same for this. So you learn how to work with trigonometric identities so that you can simplify. So when you get to these complicated trigonometric expressions, you can simplify. Okay? So the most basic one is the Pythagorean identity. So the Pythagorean identity, I'm going to remind you, unit circle, right triangle, unit circle, radius is 1, cosine, sine. The Pythagorean identity states that for any value of the angle, the cos of that angle squared plus the sine of that angle squared must equal to 1. So what I'm trying to show you here are two different ways of writing the same thing. Cosine squared, right? So if you take the cosine squared plus the sine squared, it'll always equal 1 because that's a right triangle. So let me show you one example. Okay, so let's say I want to use as my angle pi over 3. So the Pythagorean identity says the cosine of pi over 3 all squared plus the sine of pi over 3 all squared must equal to 1. Before I continue, the reason I don't put the little 2 here, we don't write it like this. This is saying you want the square of the angle. I don't want to square the angle. So you have a choice. You either write it like this or you write it like this. I know it's a weirder way to write it, but at least it avoids brackets. You have to put the 2 before because you're trying to square the cosine of the angle and not the angle itself. So what is the cosine of pi over 3? So pi over 3, right? I go to my unit circle, pretend this is pi over 3. It's not. Actually, the way I drew it, it looks more, well, it doesn't matter. No, I'll redraw it. I'll draw it here. So unit circle, you have it memorized. Pi over 3 is somewhere around here. I'm going to write it, pi over 3. And my cos is a half. My sine is root 3 over 2. So the Pythagorean identity just says that you take the cosine, which is a half. You take the sine, which is a half. Sorry, not a half, root 3 over 2 squared. And it'll always give you 1. So I'll check, I'll just do 1, but you could check for all of them. A half squared is 1 over 4. Root 3 over 2 squared is the square root of 3 squared is 3. 2 squared is 4. That is 4 over 4, and that's equal to 1. Okay, so that is the Pythagorean identity. So let me write that again. That is the most basic identity. It means that if ever you're doing a problem, okay, so if you're going to memorize one, this is the one you memorize. If ever you're doing a problem and you see cos squared and sine squared, you can actually just replace it with 1 because that's what it's equal to. So this is the basic one. This is number 1. Okay, it holds true for any value of the angle. I tested just 1. You can test as many as you want. There are actually 3. There are 3 identities that we use to simplify expressions. Okay? The second identity, I'll show you, actually comes from here. And it involves manipulating. So let's say I were to divide all of this by cosine squared. Okay, we'll arrive at another identity. Anything divided by itself is 1. Sine over cosine. Okay, the fact that they're squared, it's still the same identity. Sine over cosine is tan, but it's actually tan squared. And 1 over cosine, that's from the inverse ratios from the previous video. 1 over cosine is actually secant. And this is the second identity, okay? A fact that holds true for any values of the angle. This is identity number 2. And the third identity, okay, they all come from the basic one. They all come from the Pythagorean identity. If you were to divide everything by sine, okay, so that's how the third one was derived. Cosine over sine is cotan. Sine over sine is 1, and 1 over sine is cosecant. And this is the third identity. So right now, I would imagine some of you are maybe wondering, okay, so what am I going to do with this? You're going to use these expressions to simplify. Okay, Okay, so I want you to realize the left side is equal to the right side. Let's say in a problem you have, this comes up in a problem. Well, now you know that you can replace all of this with this. Okay, so I know a lot of you, hopefully most of you, if not, I'll try to post it on Google Classroom, have your workbook. So in your workbook, all the identities are on page 95 at the back. So those are all the identities. There are, I think, 24. And again, we use identities to simplify expressions. So now in the next video, I'm going to show you how to use these. Okay, so I'll leave you with this. So page 95, I should write that. Page 95 in the workbook is where you have all the identities. I don't expect you to memorize those. Okay, you don't have to memorize all 24 of them. I'm going to post a photo in case you don't have. I'm going to post a photo of what I'm talking about on Google Classroom. Okay, so I'll leave you at that. Right now, I want you to finish this video understanding that there are 3 facts, let's call them facts, about angles that are always true. Okay, those are the 3 main Pythagorean identities. Now, you have to always look at the next video to see how you'll use this.